Thank you, Mary. I'm Dia Tornatore, a review judge at the Healthcare Authority Board of Appeals, and I am introducing Dr. Christeine Terry. She's a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice in Seattle and at Northwest Hospital. She received her graduate degree at the University of Washington and completed her postdoc at the Palo Alto VA healthcare system. So please welcome her to talk about stress management for adjudicators.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Good morning, Ben. So, today I am here to talk about stress and burnout and hopefully give you all some practical tips that you can use in your lives at work and at home. So, as Dia said, I am a licensed clinical psychologist and I work up in Seattle, Washington. And I also work at Northwest Hospital where I work with folks with chronic pain, typically folks who have chronic rheumatological conditions. So in my work in private practice, I actually tend to see a lot of folks who work in high-stress jobs. So oftentimes they come to me with anxiety or depression, or perhaps maybe their use of drugs or alcohol has gotten a little bit out of hand and they feel uncomfortable with that. So they're coming to me to hopefully get some ideas on how they can be less stressed and also lead a life that is more consistent with how they would like to lead that life. So where are we going to go today? So let me orient y'all to where we're going. So we are going to talk about stress and burnout. And I will say the first part of this presentation may actually raise your stress levels, and that's okay, because we're going to be talking about stress. We'll also talk about burnout as well, which is related to stress, but a little bit different. It actually pertains a lot to folks who are in my field and folks for y'all as well as other people who work in kind of chronic high-stress occupations. Then we'll talk about practical tips for how to decrease stress and hopefully prevent burnout, or if you are burning out, maybe how to prevent a complete and total burnout. And then there will be time at the end for questions. And I would say that if you have a burning question that you're like, I have to know the answer to this, please feel free to raise your hand and I'm happy to answer the question. So. But if not, then I will leave time at the end, hopefully, to have a little bit of Q&A. As Mary said, the definitive list of, materials will be sent out tomorrow. So you may have my most recent set, I believe. But if not, then you will definitely have them tomorrow. Okay. So what is stress? Right? A lot of us actually tend to go around talking about like, oh, I'm so stressed out, she's so stressed out, oh, I have so much stress in my life, and then we kind of use this term, pretty easily, and I think it's helpful for us just to take a step back and actually think about what it is that we're talking about when we talk about stress, because in health and in psychology, we actually have a specific definition about stress. And so for stress, when we're talking about it from health and psychology perspectives, we're talking about kind of two components. One is the psychological perception of pressure, right? There's this sense of like, I have to get this done. There's all these things building up in my life and I have to do them all. I don't know how I'm going to do them all, right? That sense of pressure. Additionally, there is a bodily response to stress, right? And so the body's response to it, which actually involves pretty much the entire body whenever we start to experience stress. And in just a moment, we'll actually take a look at a video that will help us understand very briefly about what the body's response is to stress. So we can talk about 3 types of stress, right? So we have our overall definition of stress, and then we have actually 3 types of stress. The first type is called acute stress, and this is the stress that most of us are probably familiar with and may be experiencing right now, or very in the near future, or in the current past. and it is the most common form of stress. So it comes from the demands and the pressures of the recent past, as well as anticipated demands and pressures of the near future. So acute stress in small doses can actually be exhilarating. Like the stress, if you are a roller coaster person, like that stress can be like exhilarating, right? Right before, if you are a competitive athlete, right? Like that stress actually can be exhilarating and actually can enhance performance, right? Acute stress in work situations too, right? Like can be a little bit kind of nice, a little bit fun, right? You kind of get kind of geared up, ready to go. So a little bit of it can actually be experienced in a positive way. However, when we keep coming across long-term stress, where stress keeps cropping up again and again and again and again, what happens is that it does lead to psychological de-stress and tension headaches and upset stomachs and a whole host of other symptoms. So acute stress is typically things that we can easily, acute stress actually is something we tend to recognize pretty easily. And it's typically we can point to certain things happening in our lives, right? Like, oh, I had that car accident the other day. Oh, I have that, important meeting with my boss tomorrow. Oh yeah, I have to remember I have to take my kids to the doctor on Friday. Those are the certain things that we can kind of, when we think of acute stress, we can very often find kind of specific situations that are related to it. Because it is short-term, acute stress actually doesn't tend to have enough time to do any real damage to the body or to the psyche. So the most common symptoms of acute stress tend to be emotional distress, which is usually a combination of anger, irritability, anxiety, or depression. So we talk about anger, anxiety, and depression as being kind of the three stress emotions. We also can feel stress in our bodies. So tension headaches, back pain, jaw pain from clenching our teeth, shoulder pain, because a lot of people when they get stressed tend to do this, right, or like this. And so, right, you start to get shoulder pain there. It can also manifest itself in the GI system, so GI distress, so stomach aches, heartburn, diarrhea, constipation, all of that stuff can be related to stress. And in the short term, stress does lead to an elevation in blood pressure, heartbeat, sweaty palms, heart palpitations, cold hands or feet, and shortness of breath. And it can also lead to chest pain, right? Because the cardiovascular system is actually being activated at that time. So acute stress can crop up in anybody's life, and typically it's easy to treat and it's manageable. We can find strategies pretty quickly to manage them, or we can wait until the stressor resolves and then the stress tends to go down, right? So another type of stress, though, is episodic acute stress. And this type of stress is characterized by people who seem to suffer from acute stress very consistently. Like it's like every day, just about. There's something else going on that's kind of stressing this person out, right? And these folks tend to be over-aroused, short-tempered, irritable, anxious, tense. They seem to always be in a hurry, right? There's a sense of kind of time urgency. Like, I don't have enough time to do anything. Like, no, I can't talk to you right now because I have to go do this other thing over here. And no, honey, I don't have time to deal with that. Like, I have to go take the kids to, to their soccer practice, right? That kind of sense of like urgency and always having kind of running from one crisis to another crisis to another crisis. So this is episodic acute stress. If you all are familiar with the type A personality that was described by cardiologists Friedman and Rosenman, that is somebody who's probably experiencing episodic acute stress, right? And these are folks who tend to come across like as extremely competitive, they're aggressive, impatient, and they just always have this harried sense about them, like there's always something they have to do. So that's one form that episodic acute stress can take. Another way that episodic acute stress can present itself is by people who chronically worry, right? You may also be somebody who chronically worries, right? Like, you might be described as a worrywart. You kind of always kind of view things as like, oh, something's gonna happen, something bad's gonna happen. Oh, I just know that presentation's gonna go terribly. Like, my career's gonna be ruined, by giving a bad presentation, right? They kind of see things as dangerous, and they kind of always forecast kind of doom and gloom. And these folks, they also tend to be over-aroused and tense, but the way their anxiety manifests tends to be more anxious and more depressed and less irritable and impatient. So the symptoms of episodic acute stress are very similar to the symptoms of extended over-arousal or being stressed, and so these are persistent tension, headaches, migraines. We do start to see that it starts to take a toll on the body. We see hypertension, we see increased risk for heart attack and heart disease. So treating episodic acute stress is possible, and it generally tends to need somebody to come in for mental health treatment, more typically, but not always. And then the final form of stress is chronic stress. And these are folks that have a worldview that nothing is ever going to really change, that the world is a terrible place, that they have to be perfect at all times, right? Chronic stress tends to come about from being in environments where there's unrelenting demands and pressures, and there's really no end in sight, right? Like, so for acute stress, right, we can say like, yeah, I'm stressed out, and that's because, I have this deadline coming up. With chronic stress, there doesn't ever seem to be an end to the stress, ever. For some folks, chronic stress comes about from kind of early childhood traumatic experiences, but it doesn't have to, right? So we don't have to have trauma in our backgrounds to suffer from chronic stress, right? We can be in environments where there are kind of these unrelenting demands without any end in sight. Plus, we may have a tendency towards a worldview of things are going to be terrible, nothing's ever going to change, I have to be absolutely perfect. The difficulty with chronic stress is that with acute stress, we typically are aware of it. Like, we feel that activation in our body, or we feel that nervousness, and we're like, oh, okay, something's going on. With chronic stress, what happens is that we become used to it, and so it's just familiar. And so it's like, this is just who I am. This is who I'm going to be. So in that sense, like, it becomes difficult to kind of recognize, like, oh, maybe this is having an effect on me. Maybe I don't have to be this way. Right? Chronic stress actually has pretty significant negative effects. It can lead to suicide, violence, heart attack, stroke. And because physical and emotional resources have been pretty much depleted by attrition, the symptoms of chronic stress can be difficult to treat, and they may require kind of extended medical and mental health treatment. Again, it's not impossible, so I don't want you all to come away from this being like, oh, I have chronic stress and I'm never going to get better. Because I'd watch that thought, because that thought probably isn't the most helpful and maybe a sign of chronic stress. So, right, it is entirely possible to treat this. And I treat a lot of folks who come into my office with chronic stress, and they do find ways to relieve their stress, to manage it, and to kind of start to shift their worldview, right? So it is possible. So I don't want to kind of stand up here and be like, oh man, if you have chronic stress, you're doomed. That's it, you're done. Most definitely not. So we're going to take a look at a video that's going to show us a little bit about the changes that happen in the body. This fight or flight response. I should say that there's actually a third response. So whenever we experience stress, we can fight, right? We can flee, or we can freeze, right? So, and these are all kind of instinctual responses to stress that have been with us since the beginning of time, since humans have been here. So, so we will take a look at this video. Just a quick note, they refer to, you'll see them draw like SAM up there, and SAM stands for sympathetic adrenal medullary system. And it also will draw CRF, which is corticotropin releasing factor, and that is a hormone that's released in the stress response. So, let me take a look. There we go. So there is sound, but it's just music. They're not going to talk at all, so. So we see that actually the body does respond to stress, right? Like there's an actual physiological response, right? And if we feel stressed, it's typically because our bodies are actually like experiencing stress, right? Like so there is a psychological perception, but there's also typically a physiological component to it as well. So how stressed are we? And so, this one is a little small, but the top one says, I guess things have been kind of stressful at the office. Tomorrow is bring your therapist to work day. So, which I think would be kind of fun for good people with their works. So, since 2006, the American Psychological Association, the APA, has done a Stress in America survey where they examine the sources of stress and the impact of it on the health and well-being of Americans living in the United States. And so in 2016, they did the survey online. They had over 3,000 participants who were 18 or older. They did the interviews in both English and in Spanish. And participants would rate their overall stress and stress related to specific stressors, such as the 2016 election, on a 10-point scale of 1, little or no stress, to 10, which is a great deal of stress. Additionally, participants were asked about specific stress symptoms and their ways of coping with stress. So some good news, this was the first survey where overall stress levels actually have gone down, so they gradually decreased. And actually in 2016, the 2016 results were the lowest overall reported stress levels. But they did a survey again in 2017, because in 2016, they found that people were reporting kind of more stress about personal safety and terrorism, which hadn't been seen since 2008. So they were like, well, let's do another survey. So first off, what do they find? Well, 3 in 10 Americans actually say that they're stressed, and a sizable proportion of them are actually reporting extreme stress, and that's a rating of an 8, 9, or 10. So 1 in 3 Americans are saying that they're stressed out, and then there's 20% of them who are saying, I am really, really stressed out. The percentage of Americans who reported experiencing at least one symptom of stress over the past month from 2016 to January 2017 actually increased up to 71%. Or from 71% to 80% in 2017. And so this included physical and emotional symptoms such as headaches, feeling overwhelmed, feeling nervous or anxious, or feeling depressed. So what happened in 2016 to 2017? The election happened. And they found that people's stress levels actually rose as a result of the election. Like, okay, I'm going to back off from a definitive statement about causality. However, data is suggestive that the election led to a significant amount of stress. And so when people are talking about oh my gosh, there's so much more stress in America, well, maybe because actually APA says, yeah, people were pretty stressed out about the election and the political climate that exists now. And over half of Americans actually said that current political climate was very or somewhat significant source of stress. 66% said they were worried about the future of our nation, and 49% said that the outcome specifically of the election was resulting in more stress for them. So additionally, stress about personal safety, so this has to do with things like terrorism, things like being safe in crowds, at big events, actually rose as well, and it rose from 29% to 34%, and that is actually the highest percentage since 2008 when they first started asking the question. So stress, yes, America experiences it. Overall, it seems like it's going down, although from 2016 to 2017, we might be seeing kind of a slight uptick again. And we're seeing that people are increasingly more worried about things in the political climate as well as their personal safety. However, those aren't the top 3 worries that people endorse. The top 3 are probably ones that you can guess because they may be relevant in your life. So the top 3 are money, work, and the economy. So those are the top 3 that Americans report stressing out about. Let's move on. So here's one of the slides that may freak you out, because it tells you all the bad things that chronic stress will do to you. So in the video, they talked about that one of the effects of chronic stress is actually it can suppress the immune system. And so what that means is that folks who are under chronic stress are much more likely to get colds, flus, and then if you are somebody who comes to see me in the clinic at the Northwest Hospital, having a weakened immune system on top of a rheumatological condition can lead to a whole host of problems and worsening of the kind of arthritis and those sorts of conditions as well. So that's kind of a big emphasis on like, let's get stressed down, because right, it does have these effects across a variety of bodily systems, including our immune system. So it also has effects on the skeletal system, the musculoskeletal system, right? Tension, headaches, migraines, right? People grit their teeth, or they kind of carry a lot of tension in their neck or their shoulders, and that can actually result in chronic pain as well as tension headaches. There's a whole host of other things that can happen here, and so one of the things, I'm particularly interested in, given the field that I'm in, is in mental health, because what we see is chronic stress actually increases the risk for anxiety disorders, depression, and actually substance abuse as well. What are the warning signs? So the indicators. I always like to use the metaphor of the lights in the car, right, that tell you like your gas is running low, or check your engine, or tire pressure is low. So these are kind of our indicators when stress is on board. And again, like transient symptoms of these, like if this happens every now and again, not a problem. What we're looking for are kind of patterns, right? Like, do these keep happening? And do they last for a long time? Like your stomach is always upset, or it's upset more often than not. Are you getting a lot of headaches? Are you having a lot of back pain and neck pain? Do you tend to have difficulty falling and staying asleep, right? Are you getting sick a lot more frequently than you used to? Having difficulties with concentrating or focusing, feel jittery, feel irritable, short-tempered, or just that sense of anxiety. So in a few moments, I will actually turn to how to actually treat stress, or tips that you can use to help decrease stress. But I do want to turn for a few moments to talk about burnout, because burnout, I think, is particularly relevant for the work and the occupation that y'all are in. It sounds like it's a pretty high stress occupation, kind of in some ways similar to kind of mental health workers, right? Like there's kind of a lot of demand and perhaps not enough resources to meet all of those demands. And so burnout is different from stress in that burnout is a condition that is specific to the interpersonal stressors that are related to an occupation, whereas stress is a phenomenon that it can occur across a variety of contexts, right? Like you can have stress in your family life, you can have stress, in your hobbies, you can have stress in your friendships, right, in your marital relationships, but burnout is specific to stress at work, right? And it's actually a phenomenon that was first discussed in 1974 by a gentleman named Freudenberger, and he actually used it to describe a state of exhaustion that mental health care professionals at work. And he defined it as kind of failing, wearing out, becoming exhausted, and he proposed that it was due to excessive demands on energy, strength, and resources. And so since that time, Maslick and Leiter have really been at the forefront of this. And they are the folks who are doing a lot of the research on burnout and kind of now have come up with the definition that we use today, and that is burnout is this psychological syndrome, right, that comes from prolonged response to chronic interpersonal stressors. And it's actually characterized by 3 components. So burnout is characterized by overwhelming exhaustion. Again, it's wearing out, loss of energy, depletion, debilitation, fatigue. It's also characterized by feelings of cynicism. And so this is negative or inappropriate attitudes towards clients, right, or people you work with. It's irritability, it's loss of idealism, and it's withdrawal. The third component is a sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment, right? So this can result in reduced productivity or capability. This is low morale and an inability to cope. And so burnout is a syndrome that comes about from a product of a long time of stressful working. This isn't like one stressful day, a couple stressful days. Burnout is gradual. And so that makes it insidious in some ways because, right, it just starts to happen over time. And then finally we hit this point where it's like, oh, wow, I am really burnt out, right? And so one of the ideas about kind of talking about burnout is, and being able to recognize it, is that if we can catch it at these kind of lower levels when it's starting to happen, it's typically easier to intervene, right, when symptoms of burnout aren't at their maximal level. Still possible to intervene, just takes longer, it's a little bit harder, right? But when it's at these moderate to lower levels, we can actually, it's much easier to take care of. So burnout is actually assessed using a variety of measures. But the most common one that's used, and the one that actually has the most reliability and validity, is the Maslach burnout inventory. Unfortunately, you have to purchase it in order to use it. However, I have provided links in my slides to kind of written articles that touch upon many of the same things that the Maslach burnout inventory assesses. And so you could actually use it as a check for yourself and see like, oh, am I experiencing these things? And if so, then you might be on your way of burning out and it might be time to change some things. So the nice thing about the Maslach burnout inventory though is that it actually comes in a variety of languages, and so we can study burnout across different countries and cultures. The original and the one that is used today, the Maslach burnout inventory, is specific to caregivers, but they did create one that is a general survey version. And so that one is one that can be used across any occupation. So what are the risk factors? And again, as you see this, you might notice your stress levels start to rise because this may sound like your work environment. So there are 6 factors that have been associated with a higher risk of burnout. And basically the take-home message is that when an individual experiences incessant job demands and they have inadequate resources available to address and reduce those demands, or if they feel like they're a persistent threat to available resources, then that leads to burnout. And so you all probably work in settings where this sounds like, yeah, that's my job. That's how I work, right? I work in an environment where there's a lot of work to do and there's not a lot of resources to do it. So yes, so this just means that you may be at higher risk for burnout if you work in an environment like this. More specifically, the 6 characteristics have to do with high workload. And so high workload just basically, it causes burnout because it just depletes our resources and like our capacity to deal with stress, to do tasks, to kind of regulate our emotions and kind of be professional, right? Like that all takes resources. And so workload, if we have a heavy workload, like we just start depleting those resources, and at a certain point we just don't have anything else left to give. And another problem with high workload is that then we just don't have time to rest or recover, right? It's kind of one thing after the other after the other. Lack of control actually is related to burnout, and so folks who feel like they don't have a lot of autonomy in their work, that they don't feel like they have a capacity to influence decisions or to get the resources that they need, they tend to be at higher risk for burnout. Insufficient recognition and reward also leads to burnout, and so basically it just leads to a sense of devaluing of work and the workers. If there's a lack of support in the community, and so right, if relationships are characterized by lack of support and trust or by unresolved conflict, then there's a greater risk for burnout. Fairness is like something that we highly, highly value. Actually, they're doing research now with monkeys and they value it too. So like fairness is something that we value. And so when we perceive that there isn't fairness in our work environment, like in the decision-making process or kind of how we're treated, then we are much more likely to respond to that with like anger and cynicism, which is a risk factor, which is a type of, which is a component of burnout. And then if there's discrepancy between an organization's and a worker's values, right? And the values are ideals and motivations that have originally attracted people to their work. And it goes, and typically these are reasons that we go to work that go beyond like the paycheck and something to do. When there is a gap between what we highly value, like why we wanted to do this work or the type of work we wanted to do in our organization, then that leads to increased risk for burnout. And here we go. Here's all the bad things that can happen with burnout. So again, I think that the take-home message is basically that burnout is frequently associated with various forms of negative reactions, such as job withdrawal, low organizational commitment, high rate of absenteeism, high rate of turnover, and a higher indication that you are going to leave your job. One of the risky things about burnout is that when folks are starting to burn out, they can actually, like burnout can be contagious. And so if somebody is kind of more on the higher end of burnout and they're starting to kind of react with like cynicism and hostility, right, that creates like a community that's not very welcoming or supportive, right, and that's associated with burnout. And so folks who are kind of at the higher levels of burnout may actually lead to other people burning out too. So it's important to kind of address this from an organizational perspective because it can be contagious. Burnout is also associated with a variety of kind of health effects. Interestingly, you know, a 10-year longitudinal study found that industrial workers who were found to be burnt out, it actually predicted their risk for cardiovascular problems, and a 1-unit increase in a burnout score was associated with a 1.4 unit increase in a risk for hospital admission for mental health problems. So burnout can have these negative effects on our health and in an organization. What about burnout in the legal profession? So I did a little research, did a little digging, tried to find out like what's going on in the research world with burnout in the legal profession. Because most of this work has actually been done with caregivers and mental health professionals, right? But I did come across one study. I found one. So basically this is a study that was done in public service lawyers, which, you know, I know y'all aren't public service lawyers, but I thought, hey, there might be some affinity there. So basically what they did is they did this study in a large quasi-governmental agency, which I do not know what that means, and they did not define it any more than that. But basically they asked 391 lawyers about burnout. And they were anonymous, so folks could send them in. And basically what they found is that increased burnout was associated with high workload, like perception of high workload. And that's the trick here, because like it is an individual's perception of workload that matters, maybe not the actual workload, because we know that we perceive workload differently, right? So it's actually a perception of workload. Role conflict. So basically, if there are multiple sources of demand on the person, it means that you have to exert higher levels of effort to meet those demands, right? And again, we'll get depleted. A lack of participation in decision-making was associated with burnout. Being a supervisor is associated with burnout. So sorry, supervisors, you may have to take some extra care of yourselves. And they believe that might be due to the fact that supervisors often have to come into contact with employees who are burnt out. And in doing that, right, it's then increasing the risk for burnout, right? So what does decrease burnout? So maybe not so great for the supervisors, but for the employees who have a supportive supervisory relationship, it actually decreases their risk for burnout. Things that weren't related to burnout, and I will caution you, this is one study of 391 legal professionals, so there's still a lot more research that needs to be done. Pressure to produce actually wasn't associated with burnout. Support from colleagues, interestingly enough, wasn't, although other research suggests, like in mental health care professionals and caregivers, that is related to burnout. Autonomy wasn't, and the link between performance and reward wasn't. However, this is a small study, so we don't know exactly if it's just the result of this study, or if this is something kind of unique to kind of legal professionals, right? So, burnout versus stress. So actually job stress doesn't by itself cause burnout. So what we know is that there tends to be a combination. We need a combination of things to happen for burnout to occur. So we need a combination of high job stress. We need those certain work conditions, right? Like those work conditions that have a lack of a supportive environment, high workload, low autonomy, plus the individual's attitude about work and the importance of work in their life. So we have this combination of high job stress, work conditions that are supportive of burnout, plus an individual really identifies with their work and is a core of who they are, that will lead to burnout. You're at increased risk of burnout. So again, it's not all doom and gloom. But let's just quickly take a look at kind of what are the warning signs, those indicators again, before we talk about how to work with it. So physical and emotional exhaustion, right? Chronic fatigue, insomnia, forgetfulness, increased illness, feelings, indicators of cynicism and detachment, or that loss of enjoyment, pessimism. If you start isolating yourself at work, like you're closing your door a lot because you just don't want to deal with people, you start arriving early to avoid people, you start leaving, you start leaving early too because you're like, I just gotta get out of here, like I don't want to be around these people anymore. Like that could be a sign that something's happening there and you might want to do a little bit of investigation. Ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. If you're starting to feel apathy, hopelessness, irritability, and if your work performance tends to take a dive, right? And typically how this is manifested is that people kind of have this ever-growing to-do list and they kind of always feel stressed out about it. And it's like no matter how much they do, it never gets done and they start to get really stressed out about it, right? And that becomes a vicious cycle actually because as we get more stressed, our concentration is impaired, which then makes it harder to do the work, which then means like it takes longer to do work, which then depletes resources, and then we're fatigued, and yet there's still more work to do, and so the work we're doing is slower, we're not able to do it as quickly, and so then, right, it becomes this like vicious like feedback loop. So, what can we do about it? So this is the part of the presentation where hopefully you will have some hope. This is my favorite tip. Just please. Never go back. Right? Some days it feels like this, right? Like it's just like driving to work and it's like, oh man, if I could just, there's Mount Rainier in the distance. Yeah, I could do that. I could have a cabin. I could live off the land. Yeah, that's gonna happen, right? Yeah. So, and again, I'm not here to say that like these tips are gonna they're gonna change your life and you're, and everything's gonna be magical after doing these tips. However, kind of it is about kind of managing your stress, and if you want to stay in this job, in this occupation, if you want to engage with folks, then it's important to learn how to manage stress, right? And I will say that a lot of times whenever I give these, tips, a lot of people are like, psh, breathing. What's the point of that? Well, there actually are points to that, and, right, don't underestimate the value of consistent, small, positive changes, right? They can lead up over time to bigger changes, right? So even if things seem kind of small or not worthwhile, like perhaps be curious about that and see if you can kind of persist with that and see like over time if these small changes will actually lead to improvements in your life. And I will say that sometimes that folks who come to see me and are working on burnout ultimately do decide that they don't want to continue in their profession. That's an option, right? And so sometimes that is the work, like where if you start looking at these kind of signs and you're trying to do stuff to manage it and you're working with a professional, sometimes people come to the decision that, you know what, like, no, this actually doesn't fit for me anymore, right? And that's okay, because we're human beings and we grow and we change over time. This idea that we're supposed to stay in one job forever and ever and ever, right? Like, some folks can do that, but not everybody can. And that's okay. So, first things, self-care. And I know, like, I don't know, anytime I go to a workshop and they're like, you have to do self-care, it's just like, oh God, like, one more thing I have to do. Sorry guys, yes, you have to take care of yourself. So the very, like the low-hanging fruit here is self-care, right? Like, so here's the thing, like, if you're feeling like chronically like stressed out, burnt out, check and see, like, are you sleeping? Are you sleeping well? Are you sleeping enough? Because, you know, yes, we're individuals and we can range in how much we need, but recommendations are about 7 hours a night. So if you're chronically getting like 4 or 5 hours a night and not feeling that great, maybe see if you can work on sleep. Food, and this just seems like really simple stuff, but like, man, when blood sugar drops, we are vulnerable to strong emotions. Like, that's just it. Sorry, like, our bodies are kind of machines, and like when it like is low on fuel, like it will not work very well, right? And emotionally, we will not work very well, right? How many times, maybe some of you have noticed, like, man, right around lunchtime, I just get super cranky. I'm really irritable, and like, I don't know why that is. It might be because you're hungry. So eat something, right? Like, and again, like, these seem like really simple things, but like, these are things that actually can help regulate emotion, right? And help give us kind of that space to deal with the stress in our environments. Water is important. Are you hydrated? Like, drink water. Movement is important, and I know, like, I feel myself cringes even as I say it, because I know everybody's like telling everybody to move around now. Like, it's like, oh, move, walk, everybody has to walk. Movement is important to us as human beings, and so, like, okay, if you don't have time to do the recommendations for exercise, which are, you know, moderate activity, aerobic activity for 150 minutes, which is like, what? There's time for that. However, the thing is, what we know from research is that even small amounts of movement can be beneficial for mood, for concentration, and for happiness. And so find small ways to add it into your day. So like, if you always go get coffee at 10 a.m., I don't know, take a lap and then go get coffee, right? Like, it's 2 minutes. 2 minutes more, right? Because even that small thing kind of consistently will have a positive effect. And when doing these things, that a small positive is almost always better than doing nothing, right? If you do nothing, you know what you'll get. Doing something positive, maybe something else will happen. Another stress reduction strategy, or actually stress reduction strategy, has to do with relaxation. And there are physiological reasons why we talk so much about relaxation, right? This is not necessarily like feel good, like, oh yeah, just relax. Like, that would be nice if we could do that. However, there are actual physiological reasons why we focus on relaxation. In that video, it talked about the parasympathetic nervous system. That nervous system is designed to help us get back to baseline and also assist us in rest states. When we are stressed, our sympathetic nervous system is active. Increased heart rate, increased respiration, right? Fight or flight, like, that's happening. We can actually trigger our parasympathetic nervous system by changing our breath and by changing what we think. Like, it's pretty amazing. Like, there's this amazing feedback loop that happens between the mind and the body. And so what that means is that we actually have the capacity to shift some of those responses, right? So yes, take a few deep breaths, because that can have an actual physiological response and start to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. The other thing about triggering that parasympathetic nervous system, well, no, not the parasympathetic nervous system, but one of the things that happens whenever we become really anxious is we tend to do something called chest breathing. So we're breathing from up here, and what that does is it actually tends to increase respiration rate, and it means that our breath is, well, it means that actually we're throwing off the balance of carbon dioxide to oxygen. So, and when that is thrown off, so when carbon dioxide levels are too high, they can actually induce anxiety and panic attacks. So, taking a few deep breaths, right, is all about coming into the diaphragm and breathing from the diaphragm and slowing down our breath and regulating our breath. So that way we can restore that balance of carbon dioxide to oxygen, which will then increase panic and anxiety, right? So there's a whole variety of techniques. Some of us are massage people, that takes time and money. Some of us are like mental imagery people. Some of us want to go to breath and do breath or do yoga or movement. So when I'm asked which one is best, I say whichever one you will do. Whichever one. So if you want to go get a massage, go for it. If you want to do some mental imagery where you're on your mental vacation, right, go for that. I do like breath exercises because they are easy to do anywhere and because they do have that physiological response. And so I'd like us to do actually a very quick paced breathing exercise. And here's the thing, you can do it or not, I'm not gonna know. So do it, don't do it, I don't care. Right? I hope you will. And if you don't want to, you don't have to, right? It's just gonna be like a couple minutes and we're just gonna see what paced breathing is about. I also provide a link to a resource on how to do paced breathing that actually has a link to an MP3 or audio file that you can use to practice paced breathing on your own. One caveat, sometimes when people start to focus on the breath, they notice a spike in anxiety. This is okay, this is natural. Usually it's associated with anxiety-inducing thoughts. So one way to help with this is to take a look at your thoughts and shift them. Another helpful option is to focus on a certain part of the experience. So focus on counting the out breath or use mental imagery to help you ride out anxiety. So picture your breath as waves and your job is just to ride out each wave. Okay, so if that happens, that's okay. Just use some mental imagery to help you get through it. Okay, so we're gonna do a quick paced breathing exercise together. If you want to, you can close your eyes, but you don't have to. If you would like, you can actually put your hand on your belly to help to provide a tactile cue that you need to breathe from here and not from here. You don't have to though, right? So, but if you want to, you can. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna lead us through a few rounds of this paced breathing where I'm gonna count breath, I'll count the hold, and I'll count the exhalation, okay? Any questions before we get started? All right, let's get started. So go ahead and breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold your breath, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Do one more time. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. That's it. You are done. Okay. The whole idea about this is about triggering that parasympathetic nervous system, making the inhalation and the exhalation relatively the same in length, right? So we can restore that carbon dioxide to oxygen ratio, right? And to just get some of that effect of that kind of parasympathetic nervous system activation, right? So, as I said, in your resources, I provided a link that actually has a link to you could print it out, or you could actually download the MP3 and play it, right? The nice thing about this is that also too, you could be in a meeting and nobody has to know that you're doing paced breathing. You just be there counting your breath. Cool, right? So another stress reduction strategy is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a hot topic right now. So So basically, this is a broad term that does include a variety of different practices. It is a practice that has been used for hundreds of years in a variety of religious and spiritual traditions. More recently, in the last 40 years, psychology and medicine have taken an interest. So we are interested in this, and we're actually interested in using it as a tool to address stress, anxiety, depression, and chronic pain. And so the research on the use of mindfulness approaches to treat those conditions is actually very promising. For chronic pain, some hospitals now will offer a program called mindfulness-based stress reduction, because mindfulness-based stress reduction has been shown to decrease stress and to decrease actually severity of a lot of the chronic pain conditions and improve functioning. This is pretty powerful stuff, right? Like, so we're teaching people how to meditate, and it has these positive effects, right? The good news for us is, even if we're not suffering from anxiety or depression or chronic pain, is that mindfulness actually has been shown to increase happiness, to decrease stress, and to develop beneficial mental qualities that are associated with happiness, such as emotion regulation and self-control. More good news, even brief mindfulness interventions can have positive effects. So it can actually, again, help us develop, the skills we need for happiness. And the beauty of mindfulness is that it can be, just about anything can be done mindfully. I don't recommend mindful driving, so that one, no. But you can mindfully eat, you can mindfully wash your dishes, you can mindfully walk, you can mindfully observe your breath. So pretty much anything you can do mindfully. And for some of us who may react to kind of the more spiritual or religious connotations to mindfulness, let's just think about it as an attention and concentration skill, because that's also what it is, right? It's about focusing your attention and keeping attention on a certain experience for a specified period of time. Right? So, and again, just a little bit can help us out. So we're going to do a quick 2-minute mindfulness exercise for just 2 minutes. All you have to do is follow my voice. Your choice. You could do this. You don't have to. Nobody's going to know. And all you'll have to do is just follow the sound of my voice. And we're just going to get curious and explore some sensations. Okay? Any questions before we get started? All right. So if you want to, go ahead and allow your eyes to close, but you don't have to. If you keep them open, just a soft gaze a few feet in front of you. And let's just begin by kind of just allowing our body to settle. It might be kind of bringing attention to the weight of the body in the chair. Becoming aware that there is a body sitting on this chair. Just noticing how the body makes contact with the chair, your feet with the ground. Maybe expanding awareness to also include your breath. Just noticing the steady rise and fall of each breath. And if thoughts or emotions or urges come up, simply notice those and return your attention back to your breath. For the next minute, I'd like us to become curious observers of what our feet feel like today, in this moment. Gently bring your attention there and just allow it to rest on your feet. What do your feet feel like? What sensations are present? Is the pressure the same throughout your feet? Or does it tend to go more on the right or the left, the toes or the heels? Do your feet feel warm or cool or temperate? Are there places of tension in your feet? What do your feet feel like in the places where they make contact with another object? Maybe it's your shoe, or it's a sock, or tights. Just noticing that. And before we end our practice for today, if you are so inclined, perhaps taking a moment to notice all that our feet do for us. And if you feel so inclined, perhaps expressing a little bit of gratitude for them, for the feet that you have today. Take a couple of deep breaths, and then when you are ready, open your eyes and return to this space. Welcome back. So that was just a little bit of mindfulness, and I have provided in your resources, in the resources section, links to mindfulness practices. There are many mindfulness resources now. And so, I would say kind of find the one that works for you. I'm a huge fan of Insight Timer. One, because it's free. Two, because there are so many different mindfulness exercises to choose from, and actually you can upload your own. So if you are like, I want to take a stab at this mindfulness thing, and I want to create my own guided meditation and share it with people, you can do that on Insight Timer. So it's a lot of fun. So, all right, what else can we do to prevent burnout and stress? Well, there are, in terms of work conditions, there's some research for changing work schedules. So in a comprehensive review of interventions to address burnout, and this is again with healthcare workers, they found that shorter or interrupted work schedules do reduce stress levels. And so what they meant by shorter, the caveat here, shorter was either being kind of working 2 weeks in a row or 4 weeks in a row. Right? 2 weeks, people had were much less likely to burn out. And interrupted work schedules were folks who actually took weekend breaks versus working kind of consistently throughout the next week or 2 weeks. And so actually both were related to a reduction in stress and in burnout. So something to think about. I understand that there are probably strong organizational factors that may pull you, however, like if you are somebody who tends to work like these kind of long continuous hours, it may be worthwhile to see are there ways I can build in breaks? Is there support from my organization or from my supervisor to be able to perhaps build this in, right? Part of the difficulty with the research in this area with burnout in terms of kind of work conditions is that the studies are the studies are they're not the best, I will say. So what happens is that they tend to kind of, when they evaluate kind of work conditions to look at burnout, to see its impact on burnout, the interventions they use are multifaceted, and it gets really difficult to understand what it is exactly that's causing a decrease in burnout, right? So that was the one study where they only looked at work schedules, right? All the other studies were we can't tell you what organizational factors are going to be related to burnout because they evaluated everything. So another strategy has to do with shifting attitudes and making work more meaningful. So cognitive behavioral interventions come from cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a form of therapy that I was trained in at the University of Washington. We train a lot in cognitive behavioral therapy. The reason why we train so much in cognitive behavioral therapy is because it is one of the therapies that has the most research support behind it and its efficacy for treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a whole variety of other conditions, right? So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So they have actually taken ideas from cognitive behavioral therapy and have applied them to workplace stress. And one of the things that they found is that when they use cognitive behavioral interventions to target stress in workers and burnout workers, they found that cognitive behavioral training, as well as mental and physical relaxation, reduce stress moderately. So it has a moderate effect, so it's working. For CBT, it was found, or cognitive behavioral interventions, the ones where they retarget kind of our thinking, were actually found to decrease stress by 13%, and mental and physical relaxation were found to decrease stress by 23%. So these seem to work. So when we're talking about cognitive behavioral interventions, we're really shifting the way that we think, right? And this is the cognitive triangle, right? Like, and there should be arrows going here to here to here, right? Like, so a situation happens, and then we feel something or we do something. In cognitive behavioral interventions, we say what helps determine our emotions and actions are our thoughts, our beliefs. And these sometimes are hidden and not easy to access, right? And so the idea is to shift emotion and actions, we can shift our thinking. And by doing so, we can reduce suffering and engage in more effective behavior. So the classic example that we use in cognitive behavioral interventions is somebody cuts you off in traffic, which is like very relevant up in Seattle. So somebody cuts you off in traffic, and then you feel really angry. You feel rage. Why? Well, cognitive behavioral interventions would say because of the thoughts that you had that came up very quickly that you may not even be aware of, right? It's not fair, that's dangerous, this person's an idiot, how dare they, everybody's supposed to follow the rules of the road, and they don't, and these stupid people from California coming up here and taking all the roads, I mean, like, right, I mean, like, Amazon, it's Amazon's fault, right? I mean, like, these powerful thoughts, right? And so, like, sometimes that leads us into ineffective action, right? Like, we, like, scream at people, we're flipping them off, I mean, like, a lot of stuff that happens, right, based on these thoughts. And so the idea is like, well, let's shift our thinking, right? Like, and so this isn't about like, oh, everybody's okay how they drive, that's fine, right? No, it might be like, maybe that person didn't see me. Do you still feel angry? Yes. Do you feel rage? Maybe not, right? And it's ultimately designed to help you with your own emotions and suffering and kind of changing what you do. So let's take a look at a very classic tool that we have. Actually, I want to skip to one that was actually inspired by a colleague who works in the legal profession. This is the thought record, and if you ever go see a cognitive behavioral therapist who does cognitive therapy, this will become your friend. You will use this so many times. So basically, it's just a written tool that we use to help evaluate our thinking. Right, so the first column is the situation. So in this example, right, a supervisor schedules a meeting with me in Outlook. There's no agenda, and it's about a hearing decision that you recently worked on. Uh-oh. What is the feeling? So typically we skip over thought and we go to feeling, because feeling is typically the thing we identify more quickly, right? I'm like, oh, I feel worried, right? And we rate how worried you are, right? I'm 60% worried. How anxious are you? I'm like 70% anxious about this. I'm also curious, I'm also a little defensive too. Okay, why? What are the thoughts that show up? Like, what are the thoughts that are connected to this anxiety, to this stress, to this worry? And the thought that is most connected to it, because typically we have a lot of thoughts and we have to pick the one that's most related to the emotion, is that she thinks I did something wrong. How much do you believe that? Oh, I believe that a lot. I believe that on a scale of 0 to 100, I believe that 85%. It's a strong thought. All right, now here comes the work. In cognitive behavioral interventions, what we're going to do is we're going to take a very logical approach to thinking, and we're going to look for the evidence that supports that thought, and we're going to look for evidence that does not support that thought. And evidence is not, they are not assumptions. They're not like guesses necessarily. Like, this is actually objective evidence that like we could get a group of people together and they would probably agree to it, right? Because sometimes when people do evidence for, they're like, well, it's just like, just people always just think I'm a terrible person. First, it's probably a thought, and secondly, like, that's not really objective, and that's not really something that a group of people could get together and probably agree upon. hopefully. So what's the evidence for this thought? One is that the supervisors never asked me to meet. Oh. Another piece of evidence is that, yeah, there's been pressure in the organization, right? And that's probably something that you and your supervisor and your colleagues could all agree on. What's the evidence against this thought? Well, right? She's never asked me about a hearing decision, right? So that could go either way, right? That either supports your thought or it doesn't, right? Other evidence is that, typically she praises my work, right? She typically thinks I do a good job. And she's never tried to influence my decision making. And another piece of evidence is that, I went back and I reread it, and I think I did the right thing. Cool. So now we have our evidence for and our evidence against, and now we're going to create a balanced thought. And a balanced thought is going to include both evidence for the thought and evidence against it. Why do we do that? Because if we just focus solely on evidence against, we don't develop believable thoughts. We're just nope, I can't buy that, right? And more often than not, right, there's probably a little bit of truth in both, right? So we're going to create a balanced thought, and so some balanced thinking that was created here. One is that it's unlikely my supervisor has a problem with my order, but the program or policy staff might. And that's a pretty high level of believability. 60% is pretty high. Another alternative thought that came up was, just because the program policy staff disagrees with my order does not mean I did something wrong or that my supervisor thinks I did something wrong. It is possible she may want more information to prepare for her meeting, right? And we could rate how believable that is, right? Now we re-rate our emotions, right? And the thought, the original thought, right? How much do you believe she thinks I did something wrong? And in this case, it worked, right? Because now the balance, going through this process and coming up with a balanced thought, we see that belief decrease, that's a pretty big decrease. Typically we're looking for 10 or 15%, but man, I would take that. I love that. 20%, love it. Worried? Still worried. Yeah, of course. But not 60%. Anxious, down to 50%. Curious, 50%. And the curiosity went up, right? As she kind of considered possibilities, actually curiosity came on board. And defensiveness also went down, right? So this is a tool that you can use if you notice these patterns of anxiety or sadness or irritability keep showing up for you. Maybe it's time to get curious about your thinking. Because we know, same situation, people don't respond to it the same way, right? One meeting, somebody's totally stressed out about it, another person's in there ready to go and ready to be yeah, let's get this done, and this is so exciting, right? And another person's sitting over there being oh my God, this is the worst thing that's ever gonna happen to me, I'm gonna lose my job, it's so terrible, they just know that I left early yesterday, I left at 4:55 instead of 5 o'clock, right? Right? So if that's what's happening, try this out. And if you need help with this, there's actually now an app called CBT or iCBT, and actually it's this portable thought record, and it helps you walk through it. And of course, then you can always come in and see a therapist, right? You can always come and see me, see another psychologist, right? Somebody who's trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, and they can help you go through this and work through this. Right? And again, I provided more resources for you in the resources part of your slides. So another intervention that we can use has to do with your strengths. And so, right, personal strengths, or we call them character strengths as well, these are the positive traits that tend to be manifested in thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. These are the traits that allow us to thrive, right? So when you're being your best self, what are those traits? Well, courage and justice, right? Now, we can have signature strengths, which those are the ones that are most highly endorsed by us, right? So we all have strengths, we all have personal character strengths, but then there are some that are more valuable to us, right? And so those are our signature strengths. And so we found that when folks use their signature strengths, it actually improves well-being, and that those benefits can last up to 6 months. That's amazing. That's a pretty good effect for basically just identifying your strengths and finding small ways to live them each day. And you can have a benefit up for 6 months. That's pretty good. So additionally, these using our signature strengths is highly correlated with improved work performance, improved organizational citizenship behavior, and lower counterproductive work behavior, right? So this stuff can actually have an impact on your work. You can also look at your happiness strengths. So yes, in psychology, we actually do study happiness now. For a while, we're really focused on suffering, but understandably, but like now we're also looking at happiness too. We want to know what makes people happy, not just what makes them suffer less. So happiness strengths are those that are positively, happiness strengths are just these universal strengths that research has shown to be consistently and prominently associated with many indicators of life satisfaction among various people and cultures. And so there are 5 universal strengths associated with happiness, and they are hope, love, gratitude, zest, and curiosity. Interventions that target those happiness traits have been shown to increase life satisfaction, increase positive moods, and increase cheerfulness. And if we can increase zest, that's really good for work, because the happiness strength of zest has been found to be the most strongly associated with higher work satisfaction. For work performance, actually, if you can increase any of them or facilitate any of these, you'll see improved work performance. And we're still trying to figure out exactly which one of those strengths we need to target, but right now, if you can target any of them, you'll see an improvement in work performance. And the happiness strengths are associated with, or positively correlated with, increased work meaningfulness, increased work engagement, and increased job satisfaction. Right? How can you discover your personal strengths? Well, luckily there in your handout, I've given you a link to the Values and Classification Survey, which was created by Dr. Seligman and Peterson. And this is a free survey you can take that will help you identify what are your character strengths, right? And your top 5 are probably going to be your signature strengths. Okay? So how can we incorporate this into our lives? Well, one thing that we can do is a gratitude practice. So, and this is a common practice of increasing happiness strengths. And so we do this because it does increase positive affect, which then in turn increases well-being. It's also been found to improve life satisfaction and increase happiness. And gratitude practice has actually been shown to decrease depression symptoms. So could be some powerful stuff. So expressing gratitude can also have a positive effect on important relationships. So when we express gratitude for other people's kindness, it can improve the quality of relationships, and it can increase our own well-being. And I will say that if you're going to do gratitude practice, try to go for genuine gratitude, particularly with your loved ones, because it's actually not genuine to be like, thank you so much for taking out the trash today. Finally. Like, that's not gratitude. Like, sorry, like that isn't it. Like, it sounds like it, but the function of it is not gratitude, right? So like we need to sometimes we have to find very, 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 very small things to be grateful for, right? And that's okay. Like, and gratitude doesn't have to be that big. Like, if all you can muster is like, hey, thank you for doing that, fine. Right? A supportive hand on the shoulder. Like, don't underestimate how powerful your love and care and concern can be for your loved ones. It's incredibly powerful. So for gratitude practice, it often takes the form of kind of focusing on appreciation and reflecting on the feeling of gratitude. And one way that you can do this is by writing down every day 10 things that you're grateful for. But items can repeat, and they don't have to be very big. Like, for instance, on my list, I'm grateful for gluten-free banana bread. Yes, that's what I'm grateful for, right? It's part of what I'm grateful for. I'm grateful for my health and my family and all that too, but sometimes we're grateful for the small things too, right? So they can be as big as small as you want. They can repeat, that's okay. An additional idea is to find ways to express kindness to a loved one each day. Again, not very big. Thank you. Thanks for doing that. Even I see how much you're doing, right? Just acknowledging that somebody's doing something is pretty powerful too. Okay, I have 10 minutes remaining. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So here are some additional cognitive behavioral interventions, and I anticipated I would probably run out of time, so I provided resources for you all so you all could investigate a little bit more. Time management, we could easily spend a day talking about time management strategies. My one tip is that it's, well, a couple things. One, it's not so much about managing time, it's actually about managing the events in your life in relation to time. We don't get more time, right? We have to make do with what we have, and so it's about managing the events in your life, right? The first step is to actually see where you're spending your time, and you will probably be surprised to find out where you're spending your time. Facebook takes a lot more time typically than we think. Checking email takes a lot more time than we typically think, right? Like, so the first step is just like getting it, just see where you're spending your time. And then take a look and see, like, is that where I want to be spending my time? If not, okay, time to make some changes, right? It'll also, like, if that is where you have to spend your time, it will at least give you like a chance to realistically plan. Because we think like, oh yeah, that email's just gonna take me like 5 minutes, and then you look at your time log and you're like, oh man, email consistently takes 15 minutes. Well, schedule 15 minutes for email then, right? The other piece of this about time management has to do with kind of setting priorities and identifying what actually is most important to you and figuring out ways to have your time reflect that. Limitations and boundary setting, so we often need to set limitations or boundaries in order to move towards what's important to us, and boundaries are useful in relationships, and being able to identify them and to keep them actually help prevent resentment and overcommitting ourselves and allow us to feel more control over time. We can also look at communication strategies. I'm guessing you all are very effective communicators. So, however, I will say that like sometimes we need to tweak our communication and see like, is there something that I could be doing a little bit different here? Now I tend to be really long-winded. Okay, let me see if I can be briefer, right? Or I tend to, not say exactly what I want. Okay, let me fix that. Problem solving, right? So you could use a variety of problem solving strategies to help. I like this idea of building tiny habits and then piggybacking habits. So building tiny habits has to do with like, take a behavior like that you want to engage in and break it into small chunks. Oftentimes we set really high goals that are impossible for us, and then we get frustrated with ourselves whenever we don't do them, right? We're like, I'm gonna floss every night. Too big. Go small. Put out the floss every night. That's it. If you floss, great. If you don't, okay. Floss 1 tooth. And this seems like ridiculously small, but there are reasons why we're doing this, because like small changes are actually easier for us to sustain, right? And we can build on small changes to bigger behavior patterns, and that is what we're trying to do. This other idea of piggybacking is like, if you, like I said earlier, like if you always get coffee at 10 o'clock and you're trying to build in exercise, guess what? Piggyback exercise onto that 10 a.m. coffee, right? Like, go a few extra steps. Go down the stairs, go back up the stairs, you go get coffee. Will people think you're kind of weird because you're doing it? Maybe, I don't know. But like, are you doing exercise? Yes. So, right, if you have a well-established habit and are trying to change behavior, attach it to that well-established behavior, right? Because you will be much more likely to do it. Let me just go through these really fast. Values. So, values are basically, we get to choose them. They're global paths in life, they're directions. I like to think of values as a quality of action and not a thing, because, right, like, we can actually act in accordance with the values, as opposed, when it's a thing, it's a little bit harder to move towards. You think of it as kind of directions versus goals. Sometimes life happens to us and we are faced with the task of trying to find meaning again, right? And so that happens at work. Like, what initially led you to pursue this career? When you're doing your best work, what are the traits that you're using? And when you show up at your retirement party, how do you want people to talk about you? What do you want them to say? Like, if they could say anything that you wanted them to say, what would they say? This might start to give you a clue as to, like, that's what's important to me. Now, the challenge is find ways to do it every day. So I will leave you with this out of talk practice assignment. I don't like to say homework. Out of session, like out of meeting practice, right? So here's the thing that I hope that you'll take from this is that, take a look at all these different factors that we talked about with burnout, right? Like here are the 3 components of it. Here are some ideas. This is not an exhaustive list. Here are some ideas about what you might do to tackle each of these, right? And so I'd like you to try, if you're willing, find one small thing to try, and give it a fair try. Try it out for a little while and see how it goes. If it doesn't work, try something else, right? So if you want to do breathing, try out some paced breathing. If you want to do gratitude journaling, go for that, right? If you want to take a crack at the, the thought record, try that out too, right? You can take a look at that ICBT. All right, I have 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
Where do Americans fall on the burnout scale? Higher, like more frequent burnout
Versus other countries?
Yeah.
Typically, yes.
With the limited ability to take time off.
Yes. So typically, typically when we compare it to countries like Finland, Sweden, Finland and Sweden always get held up like, Finland and Sweden. Yes, our burnout rates tend to be higher than, in other countries. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Do you have any tips for boundary setting with respect to social media and news? Like if someone's identified news, current events as a stressor,
Yes.
how do they walk that line between being informed but setting a boundary so that they're not just like, they
Obsessed.
open up Apple News and
Just there for
everything
hours.
goes, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I hear you, especially right now with everything happening. So one thing that I recommend folks do is that they set a timer for five minutes. That's one idea. Like you've got 5 minutes, and that's what you get to. That's your news time, and that's it. For some folks, they actually decide to just take a week off, and then other folks, what they do is they subscribe to the headlines, right? Like in Apple News, like they, the New York Times has just like a headlines feature, and like that's it. Like that's what you get. So you get to stay informed, but you don't have to go and read all of that, right? So additionally, I tell folks to not do it before bed and not first thing in the morning. It's a hard start to the day, right? If you're somebody who's prone to kind of stress and anxiety. So those are some ideas, right, that you could try out, but it's tough, yeah. Oh, and also turn off your notifications. Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, all of them, turn them off, because that stuff is actually kind of addictive for us. Like every time that happens, we get a hit of dopamine. So it then becomes harder to break, so turn it off. And the other thing too is that we think oh yeah, that doesn't have any impact on me. Yeah, I can totally get notified and just keep working. We are terrible at task switching, and we're terrible at multitasking. So I would just recommend turn them off. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So the cognitive behavioral tracking thing you did?
Yeah.
What was the meeting about?
What was the meeting about? It sounded like the policy folks, they disagreed, right? Not necessarily the supervisor thought it was that she had done something wrong. It's just that the policy folks disagreed, right? And so basically the supervisor needs more information. Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you all so much for your time and attention. My contact info is on these slides, so please feel free, reach out if you need additional resources or have any questions about the resources or need any help finding folks for additional support. Please do feel free to send me an email. Thank you.